Something about this situation feels off, and the more you look at it, the harder it is to ignore. Because how do you go from helping your own sister secure a home, to allegedly fighting just to get your money back? And when that sister is Tamar Braxton, and the person on the other side is her own sister Towanda Braxton, things hit very differently. What started as a moment of love and support inside the Braxton family has now turned into something much heavier. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars, a house, and a promise that, according to some claims, was never meant to be kept. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because at one point, it seemed like there was no confusion at all. Gratitude was shown. The help was acknowledged. Everything appeared clear. But somewhere along the way, the story changed, and suddenly what was once described as support with expectations allegedly became just a gift. And once paperwork, timelines, and financial records started being mentioned, this stopped sounding like a simple family misunderstanding. Now it feels like something deeper is being hidden. And if even part of this is true, then this isn't just messy. It's calculated. To really understand how things between Tamar Braxton and Towanda Braxton reached this point, you have to go back to a time when none of this tension was visible to the public. On the surface, the Braxton sisters always presented a united front, tight-knit, supportive, and bonded not just by blood, but by shared struggles in the entertainment industry. From music to reality television, their dynamic was built on personality, humor, and what seemed like unbreakable loyalty. But like many families, especially ones navigating fame and finances at the same time, things weren't always as smooth behind the scenes as they appeared on camera. According to what has been publicly discussed and debated, this situation began during a period when Towanda was in the process of securing a home. Buying a house is a major step for anyone, and it often comes with financial hurdles, especially when it comes to down payments and proving funds to lenders. In many families, it's not unusual for one relative to step in and help another during moments like this. And in this case, Tamar allegedly did exactly that. The claim is that Tamar provided a substantial amount of money, reportedly around $50,000, to help Towanda secure her home. Now, that's not a small gesture. That's not something you casually forget or misinterpret. That kind of financial support usually comes with clear communication, especially when it's tied to something as serious as real estate. And from Tamar's perspective, there was an understanding attached to that money. It wasn't just about helping. It was about temporarily assisting with the expectation that the funds would be returned. At least, that's how Tamar has described it. What makes this situation more complex is that there are moments, both on and off camera, where it appears that Towanda acknowledged receiving the money. There are claims that gratitude was expressed, that appreciation was shown, and that at one point, there wasn't any disagreement about where the funds came from or why they were given. But as time went on, that clarity seemed to fade. Instead of the situation being treated as a loan or a temporary financial assist, the narrative allegedly shifted into something else entirely. Towanda began framing the money as a gift, something given freely without any expectation of repayment. And that's where the tension really started to build. Because from a practical standpoint, that explanation raised questions. In real estate transactions, especially when dealing with lenders, large sums of money don't just appear in someone's account without explanation. There are verification processes. There are requirements to disclose where the money came from and whether it's a loan or a gift. If it is a gift, there's typically documentation to support that claim, often in the form of a gift letter stating that the funds do not need to be repaid. So naturally, people began wondering how this particular situation was structured. If Tamar's money was used as part of the down payment, then there had to be some form of documentation tied to it. And if there was documentation, what did it actually say? Did it reflect a gift, as Towanda later claimed? Or did it indicate something closer to a loan, as Tamar has insisted? Those questions only grew louder when discussions about financial filings started entering the conversation. At some point after the home purchase, reportedly less than a year later, Towanda filed for bankruptcy. Now, bankruptcy in itself is not uncommon, especially for individuals navigating financial pressure. But what caught people's attention was the claim that Tamar was listed as a creditor in those filings. And that detail changes everything. Because being listed as a creditor suggests that, at least in official documentation, there was an acknowledgement of money owed. It implies that the funds weren't simply a gift with no strings attached. Instead, it introduces the possibility that there was indeed an expectation of repayment, one that may not have been fulfilled. Of course, it's important to approach this carefully. Bankruptcy filings can include a wide range of financial obligations, and listing someone as a creditor doesn't always tell the full story. There are legal strategies involved, and sometimes people include debts in ways that don't necessarily reflect personal intent. But when you place that information alongside public statements denying any obligation to repay, it creates a contradiction that's hard to ignore. And contradictions like that tend to fuel speculation. From Tamar's perspective, the situation reportedly didn't just stop at the house. There have been claims that she provided additional financial support over time, including covering certain expenses and allowing access to her credit resources. Allegedly, this included things like phone bills and other recurring costs that added up over time. Now, again, helping family isn't unusual. But when multiple layers of financial support begin to stack on top of each other, the dynamics can shift. What starts as generosity can start to feel like imbalance, especially if there's no clear effort to settle or acknowledge what's been given. And that's where emotions begin to enter the picture in a much deeper way. Because for Tamar, this isn't just about numbers on paper. It's about feeling like she showed up when her sister needed her, only to later feel dismissed or even misrepresented. It's about the frustration of watching a situation unfold publicly in a way that doesn't align with her version of events. And perhaps most importantly, it's about how the rest of the family responded. There have been moments where it seemed like other members of the Braxton family were aware of parts of this situation. Moments where their reactions hinted that they knew more than what was being openly said. But instead of stepping in to clarify things, it often appeared that they chose to stay neutral, or in some cases, side with Towanda's version of the story. That silence didn't go unnoticed. Because when multiple people are close to a situation, and choose not to speak up, it can create the impression that there's something being protected. Whether that's intentional or not, it shifts how the public interprets everything. And unfortunately, in situations like this, perception can become just as powerful as reality. For Tamar, who has been open about her personal struggles and emotional experiences, that perception carries even more weight. When someone has already been vulnerable in the public eye, it becomes easier for critics to dismiss their claims as exaggerated or emotionally driven, rather than grounded in fact. And that's where things can become especially complicated. Because now, it's not just about whether money was given or owed, it's about credibility. It's about who the audience believes. It's about whether one person's truth is being validated or quietly rewritten in real time. As this situation continued to unfold, the gap between both sides only seemed to widen. The more Tamar spoke about her experience, the more resistance she appeared to face, not just from Towanda, but from the surrounding narrative as well. And at this point, the story was no longer just about a financial disagreement. It was about trust that may have been broken. It was about loyalty that may not have been returned. And it was about a situation that, at first glance, looked like a simple act of sisterly support, but was quickly starting to feel like something much more complicated. Because once timelines, money, and conflicting stories all collide, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Was this really just a misunderstanding? Or was something else happening behind the scenes that hasn't fully come to light yet? As the situation between Tamar Braxton and Towanda Braxton continued to unfold, what once looked like a confusing misunderstanding began to take on a much sharper edge. Because now, it wasn't just about whether money had been given or how it was labeled. It was about the sequence of events that followed, and how those events started to paint a picture that felt a little too intentional for comfort. When people began lining up the timeline, that's when things really started to shift. The home purchase reportedly took place in 2018, with Tamar's financial support playing a key role in helping Towanda secure it. That alone wouldn't have raised too many eyebrows if everything that followed had been straightforward. But less than a year later, in 2019, Towanda filed for bankruptcy. And it's that timing that continues to spark conversation. Because on the surface, it creates a very specific narrative. Money comes in. A house is secured. Then shortly after, a legal filing appears that could potentially restructure, or even eliminate certain debts. And within that filing, Tamar's name allegedly appears as someone who is owed money. Now, again, it's important to approach this carefully. Bankruptcy law is complex, and people file for a wide range of reasons. It doesn't automatically mean wrongdoing. But when you combine that filing with public statements that deny any obligation to repay, it creates a tension that's difficult to explain away. Because both things can't be true at the same time. Either the money was a gift with no expectation attached, or it was something significant enough to be formally acknowledged in financial documents. And that contradiction is what continues to keep the story alive in conversations. From Tamar's point of view, the situation reportedly didn't just feel like a misunderstanding, it felt like a shift in behavior. There's been discussion suggesting that promises may have been made early on, including claims that repayment would happen quickly, even as soon as the next day. But as time passed, those promises allegedly weren't fulfilled. And instead of clarity, there was silence. That silence is where frustration tends to grow the most. Because when communication breaks down, especially over something as serious as money, people start filling in the gaps themselves. They start asking why things changed, why the story feels different now, and whether those changes were accidental or strategic. Adding to that frustration were claims about additional financial support beyond the initial house situation. Tamar has reportedly suggested that her assistance didn't stop at the down payment, that there were ongoing expenses, including phone bills and other costs, that she helped cover over time. If those claims are accurate, it introduces another layer to the dynamic. Because now it's not just about a single transaction, it's about a pattern. A pattern where one person continues to give, and the other continues to receive, without a clear resolution in sight. And when patterns like that go unchecked, they tend to create resentment. But what truly escalated this situation wasn't just the financial side, it was the way everything began to play out publicly. Because instead of a private resolution, the disagreement became something that unfolded in front of an audience. And that changes everything. Once a situation becomes public, it's no longer just about what happened, it's about how it's perceived. It's about who controls the narrative, who speaks first, and who appears more believable in the eyes of viewers. In this case, there were moments where Tamar's claims were met with pushback, not just from Towanda, but from the broader family dynamic as well. And that's where things started to feel less like a disagreement and more like a divide. Because instead of a unified effort to get to the truth, it often appeared as though sides were being taken. There were reactions, subtle at times, more direct at others, that suggested certain family members were standing behind Towanda's version of events. Whether that was out of loyalty, perspective, or something else entirely, it created an environment where Tamar seemed increasingly isolated in her stance. And that kind of isolation can amplify everything. Because now, it's not just one person questioning your truth, it's multiple voices, directly or indirectly, casting doubt on your experience. And when that happens on a public platform, it can feel less like disagreement and more like being discredited in real time. That's where the emotional weight of this situation becomes impossible to ignore. Because beyond the money, beyond the paperwork, there's a deeper issue at play, one that revolves around trust and validation. When someone feels like they've been wronged, the natural expectation is that those closest to them will at least acknowledge their perspective. But when that doesn't happen, the impact can be just as painful as the original issue itself. And then came the statements that really caught people's attention. There were moments where Tamar hinted that she had more information, more details, more context, more receipts, as people like to call it, that hadn't been fully revealed yet. Statements that suggested this situation might only be scratching the surface of a much larger story. Those kinds of hints don't just add curiosity, they add pressure. Because now, people start wondering what hasn't been said. What details are still hidden? And whether those details, if revealed, would completely shift how the entire situation is understood. At the same time, Towanda's position reportedly remained consistent in framing the money as a gift. And from her perspective, that framing changes everything. Because if there was never an expectation of repayment, then the entire argument becomes something else entirely, a misunderstanding, rather than a financial dispute. But again, that brings everything back to the same central issue. The contradiction. Because when public statements, private claims, and documented timelines don't align, it creates a gap that's difficult to close. And in that gap, speculation grows. Some people see it as a simple case of miscommunication that spiraled out of control. Others believe there's something more calculated behind it, a series of decisions that, when viewed together, suggest intent rather than confusion. And then there's the question of motive. Because in situations like this, people naturally start asking why. Why would someone shift their story? Why would someone deny something that appears to be documented elsewhere? And why would others around them choose not to clarify things if they had the ability to do so? Those questions don't always have clear answers. But they do create tension. And that tension is what keeps this story from settling. Because at this point, it's no longer just about figuring out what happened, it's about figuring out what's being left out. It's about reading between the lines, connecting the dots, and trying to understand whether this situation is exactly what it looks like. Or something even more complicated beneath the surface. And as more people revisit the timeline, re-examine the claims, and listen closely to what's been said, and what hasn't, the story continues to evolve. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't come out all at once. Sometimes, it reveals itself piece by piece, right when you least expect it. By the time everything between Tamar Braxton and Towanda Braxton reached its peak, the situation had already gone far beyond a private disagreement. What started as a financial question had now turned into something that touched reputation, family loyalty, and public perception in a way that couldn't simply be brushed off or quietly resolved behind closed doors. Because once a story like this becomes public, it doesn't just stay between the people involved. It grows. It spreads. And more importantly, it starts to shape how everyone sees you. For Tamar, the fallout reportedly wasn't just about the money, it was about how she was being portrayed. There were moments where her reactions, her tone, and even her emotional responses were used to frame her as unstable or overly dramatic. And in situations like this, perception can be just as damaging as reality. Because when someone is labeled as too emotional, it becomes easier for others to dismiss what they are saying. And that's what made this situation feel heavier. Because from Tamar's perspective, she wasn't just trying to get clarity about money, she was trying to defend her truth. She was trying to explain what happened from her point of view, while feeling like that version of events was being questioned, minimized, or even rewritten in real time. And when that kind of pushback doesn't just come from one person, but appears to come from multiple people within your own family, it hits differently. It creates a sense of isolation. Because now, it's not just about disagreement, it's about feeling outnumbered. There were moments where it seemed like the family dynamic itself played a role in how everything unfolded. Instead of a clear effort to get to the bottom of things, it often felt like there was a quiet alignment happening, one that didn't necessarily favor Tamar's side of the story. Whether that alignment came from loyalty, long-standing dynamics, or simply a desire to avoid deeper conflict, it had an impact. Because to the outside world, it looked like Tamar was standing alone. And in the court of public opinion, that matters. At the same time, Towanda's stance reportedly remained steady. The money, from her perspective, was a gift. A gesture of support from one sister to another, with no expectation attached. And by maintaining that position, she effectively reframed the entire situation. Because if it was truly a gift, then there was nothing to repay. No obligation. No debt. No wrongdoing. But again, that brings everything back to the same unresolved tension. The difference between what's being said and what appears to be documented. Because if there are records suggesting something else, if there are timelines that don't quite match up, or filings that hint at a different reality, then the situation becomes harder to define in simple terms. And that's where the public starts to split. Some people believe Tamar completely. They see the sequence of events, the emotional reactions, and the alleged documentation, and they feel like the story speaks for itself. To them, it looks like someone helped their sister in a major way, and was later left in a position where they had to defend that help. Others see it differently. They believe that family situations can be complicated, that communication can break down, and that not every disagreement needs to be turned into something deeper. From that perspective, this could be a misunderstanding that escalated because it wasn't handled privately. And then there are those who sit somewhere in the middle. Watching. Listening. Trying to piece together what's true, what's exaggerated, and what might still be missing from the story entirely. Because even now, there are gaps. There are details that haven't been fully clarified. Moments that haven't been fully explained. And statements that, depending on how you interpret them, can point in completely different directions. And that uncertainty is what keeps the conversation going. Because people don't just react to what they know, they react to what they think they know. What makes this situation even more impactful is how it intersects with everything else these women have built publicly. Their careers, their image, their legacy as a family, all of it becomes part of the conversation. Because now, it's not just about what happened in one moment. It's about what this situation says about the bigger picture. It raises questions about trust within the family. About how conflicts are handled. About whether support is given freely or comes with expectations that aren't always clearly defined. And those are questions that don't have easy answers. Especially when emotions are involved. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a story about money, it's a story about relationships. About what happens when those relationships are tested. And about how people respond when they feel like they've been wronged, misunderstood, or unsupported. For Tamar, the experience reportedly left a mark, not just financially, but emotionally. Because being in a position where you feel like you have to prove your truth, especially to people who already know you, is exhausting. And for Towanda, maintaining her version of events means standing firm in a narrative that continues to be questioned by some and defended by others. And somewhere in between those two positions is the truth. Or at least, a version of it. But whether that truth will ever be fully revealed is still uncertain. Because sometimes, in situations like this, the full story doesn't come out all at once. It comes out slowly. In pieces. Through comments, interviews, subtle hints, and moments that only make sense when you look back at them later. And until that happens, the tension remains. The questions remain. And the possibility that there's more to this story than what we've seen so far, remains. Because if there's one thing this situation has made clear, it's this: not everything that looks like family support is as simple as it seems. And not every story ends with clear answers. Sometimes, it just leaves you wondering what really happened behind the scenes. And after hearing all of that, the real question is, where do you stand on this situation involving Tamar Braxton and Towanda Braxton? Do you believe this was just a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control? Or does it feel like something deeper was going on behind the scenes the entire time? Because when you look at the timeline, the emotions, and the claims being made, it's hard not to have an opinion. And honestly, this is one of those stories where every detail matters, and every perspective adds another layer to what might really be the truth. So I want to hear from you. If you were in Tamar's position, how would you have handled it? And if you were in Towanda's place, would you have done anything differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments, let's really talk about it. And if you're into deep dives like this, where we break down the stories people don't always tell clearly, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because trust me, this story might not be over yet.